In 2009, a researcher opened a box in the National Archives of Norway in Oslo and found 91 names that no one had been looking for. The documents were not hidden. They had not been deliberately concealed or locked away in some secret vault. They were simply filed, stored, catalogued, and forgotten in the way that historical records are forgotten when no one alive remembers why they matter. Church records, court records, trial transcripts from the 17th century, written in archaic Danish-Norwegian script on pages that had gone brown and brittle with age. The handwriting was cramped and formal, the language stilted, the content bureaucratic. Lists of charges, lists of testimonies, lists of sentences carried out, lists of the dead. What the researcher found was documentation of one of the most intense witch persecutions in European history, and almost no one in Norway knew it had happened. 91 people executed for witchcraft in a single Arctic village between 1621 and 1692. Not over the course of a century across an entire country, but in one small community, in one remote location, over 70 years of sustained terror. The trials had been documented. Every accusation, every confession, every sentence had been written down by court officials and sent to authorities in Copenhagen and Oslo. The paperwork had been filed properly. The bureaucracy of death had functioned exactly as designed. And then the records had been archived, and the files had been closed, and the whole thing had simply disappeared from memory. This was not a recent discovery in the sense that historians had never known about the Finnmark witch trials. Scholars had written about them in academic journals. A few Norwegian historians had published books and articles over the decades. The information existed. But it existed the way most historical atrocities exist in the public consciousness, which is to say barely. It was not taught in schools, it was not commemorated, it was not part of the national narrative. If you grew up in Norway, even if you grew up in Vardø itself, you could live your entire life without ever hearing that 91 people had been burned alive in your town. The 2009 research was different, because it was not just about recovering facts, it was about recovering names. The historian Liv Helene Wilhelmsen spent years working through the trial documents, translating the old script, cross-referencing testimonies, reconstructing individual cases from fragmentary evidence scattered across multiple archives. She was not interested in statistics. She was interested in people. She wanted to know who these 91 individuals were, what they had been accused of, what they had confessed to or denied, how they had died. And she wanted their names. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Historical records are messy. Names are spelled inconsistently. Women's names change when they marry. Records get damaged. Pages go missing. Entire trial transcripts vanish. Sometimes all you have is a first name and a place of origin. Sometimes you have nothing but the widow or the Sami woman. Wilhelmsen reconstructed 91 individual stories from the fragments. 91 names. 91 lives that had been reduced to a line in a court ledger, and then forgotten. When she published her findings, when the research became public, when Norwegian media began to cover the story, something extraordinary happened. People in Vardø had no idea. Residents of the town were interviewed by journalists, and they said the same thing again and again. We did not know this happened here. We did not know our town had done this. We were never told. This is a community that had lived on top of its own history for 400 years without knowing what was buried beneath it. Part of this was distance. 400 years is a long time. Memories fade. Oral traditions break. The people who witnessed the trials died, and their children died, and eventually there was no living connection. But part of it was deliberate forgetting, because what happened in Vardø during the witch trials was not something an outside force did to the community. It was something the community did to itself. The accusers and the accused lived in the same houses. They worshipped in the same church. They worked the same fishing grounds. Remembering the trials meant remembering that your ancestors might have been the ones pointing fingers, that your family line might include not just victims, but perpetrators. That the woman burned at the stake and the woman who testified against her might both be in your family tree. It is easier to forget. And then in 1944, the Nazis burned Vardø to the ground during their retreat from northern Norway. Every building destroyed, every structure reduced to ash and rubble. The entire population evacuated into the frozen landscape with nothing but what they could carry. When they came back and rebuilt, the new Vardo looked nothing like the old one. The physical connection to the past was severed. The buildings where accused women had lived, the grounds where they had burned, all of it buried under new construction and new trauma. A more recent horror overwrote the older one. For decades after World War II, Vardo remembered the Nazis and forgot the witch trials. One catastrophe eclipsed another, and 91 people remained unnamed, unremembered, unmourned. Until 2009, until a researcher opened a box in Oslo and decided the names mattered. Until the records were translated and published, and the stories were told and the silence that had lasted for 3 centuries finally broke. The discovery was not just about finding documents. It was about deciding that what happened in Vardo was worth remembering, that the 91 deserved to be more than a footnote, that their names should be spoken aloud again. In 2011, 2 years after the research became public, Norway built a memorial. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand where Vardo is, because the location is not just context. The location is the reason Vardo sits at the end of the world, 70 degrees north latitude, above the Arctic Circle. On a small barren island at the absolute northeastern tip of Norway, the easternmost town in the entire country, further east than Istanbul, further east than Cairo, closer to the North Pole than to Oslo. If you kept going east from Vardo, the next country you would reach is Russia. If you went north, there is nothing but ice until the pole. This is not a place you pass through on your way to somewhere else. This is a place you go to because you have decided to live at the edge of the map, where the ocean turns to ice and the sun obeys different rules than the ones you learned as a child. In winter, the sun does not rise. Not for a day or two, for 2 months. From late November to late January, Vardo exists in a state of permanent twilight shading into permanent night. The sky never gets fully bright. At midday in December, you get a few hours of deep blue dusk, a faint glow on the southern horizon where the sun is moving somewhere beneath the curve of the earth. Then the blue fades to black, and you are in darkness again. The darkness is not like the darkness you know. It is total. It is absolute. It is the kind of darkness where you can lose your sense of direction walking from your house to your neighbor's door 30 feet away, where the line between sea and sky disappears, where the world becomes a void punctuated only by the lights you bring with you. The cold is worse. Temperatures in winter drop to -30 Celsius, sometimes lower. The wind comes off the Barents Sea at speeds that can knock a grown man off his feet. Frostbite happens in minutes. Exposed skin freezes. Your breath crystallizes in the air in front of you, and the wind does not stop. It screams across the treeless island day and night, howling around the corners of buildings, driving snow into every crack and gap, making the cold feel like a living thing trying to get inside you. There are no trees on Vardo. Nothing grows tall enough to break the wind. The island is rock and low scrub, and grass that bends flat under the constant gale. In summer, wildflowers bloom in the brief weeks when the ground thaws, tiny bursts of color clinging to stone. Then winter comes back and buries everything again. In summer, the opposite happens. For 2 months, from late May to late July, the sun never sets. Daylight is constant, unbroken, disorienting in a different way. The sun circles the horizon, dipping low but never disappearing. Midnight looks like noon. Time loses meaning. Sleep becomes difficult. People who live through the midnight sun describe it as dreamlike, unreal, a state where your body does not know when to rest because the light never stops. Some people love it. Some people go slowly mad. This is the place. This is where people chose to live for one reason: fish. The Barents Sea, despite its cold and its storms, is one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. Cod migrate through these waters in massive schools, millions of fish moving through the Arctic currents. For centuries, the people of northern Norway built their entire economy on this migration. The men went out in small open boats, sometimes for days at a time, to catch cod. The women stayed on shore and processed the catch, splitting and drying the fish on massive wooden racks that lined the coastline. Dried cod, stockfish, became one of Norway's primary exports. It fed Europe. Vardø was not just a fishing village. It was a trade hub, a fortified outpost, a strategic location where Danish-Norwegian authorities maintained control over the far north. A fortress was built on the waterfront in the 1730s, a star-shaped stone structure designed to project power over this distant territory. But long before the fortress, before the trade, before the formal colonial administration, people lived here. The Sami had lived in Finnmark for thousands of years. The Norwegians came later, pushing north along the coast, establishing settlements, intermarrying with the Sami, creating a mixed community that spoke multiple languages and lived according to rhythms dictated by the fish and the seasons and the sun. It was a hard life, but it was a life that worked until it did not. The isolation that had protected Vardø, the distance that had allowed the community to develop its own rhythms and traditions, became a trap. Because when things went wrong, there was no escape, no neighboring town to flee to. No authority to appeal to that was not weeks of travel away across frozen, roadless wilderness. No way out except the sea, and the sea in winter was more dangerous than staying put. When disaster struck, the community had to absorb it alone. When fear took hold, it spread through the village like fire through dry wood, because everyone knew everyone, and there was nowhere to hide and no outside perspective to interrupt the spiral. When the trials began, the remoteness meant no one was watching, no oversight, no intervention, just a small community at the edge of the world, alone in the dark, deciding who among them deserved to burn. The geography made it possible. The cold, the dark, the isolation, the inescapable closeness of a place where your neighbor's face was the only face you saw for months at a time. Vardø's location was not incidental to what happened. It was the reason. In 2011, Norway did something I do not think gets enough attention. They built a memorial to 91 people who had been forgotten for 300 years, and they built it in the place where those people had died. The memorial is called Stalneset. It sits on the northeastern edge of Vardø, on the same ground where the executions took place. The same frozen patch of earth where women were burned alive within sight of the fortress that had imprisoned them. Two structures, two artists, two different ways of saying the same thing. Remember them. The first structure was designed by Peter Zumthor, a Swiss architect known for buildings that feel less like objects imposed on a landscape and more like places the landscape was always meant to have. What he built in Vardø is 125 meters long, a narrow wooden corridor elevated slightly off the ground, supported by a skeletal framework of timber beams that looks unfinished, exposed, fragile. The entire structure is wrapped in a stretched membrane of translucent fabric that glows when light hits it and cracks like a sail in the Arctic wind. From the outside, it looks like something temporary, like something that might blow away in the next storm, like something that barely exists. From the inside, it is a tunnel. You enter at one end and walk down a long, dark corridor. The fabric overhead filters the light into a soft, diffuse glow. The wind outside is audible, the membrane shuddering and snapping. You feel the cold. You feel the isolation. And on both sides of the corridor, set into the wooden frame at regular intervals, are light bulbs. 91 light bulbs, one for each person who was executed. Each bulb hangs in its own small window. Beneath each window is a plaque. On each plaque is a name and a summary of that person's trial, written in Norwegian and English, taken directly from the original court records. The plaques tell you everything in plain language. What the person was accused of, what they confessed to or denied, how they were interrogated, what happened to them. And every single one ends the same way: convicted, burned at the stake, or tortured to death during interrogation, body burned, or drowned during water test. Body burned, you walk down the corridor and you read them one after another. The first name, the second, the 30th. By the time you reach the 50th, the repetition is unbearable. Accused of summoning storms, burned. Accused of poisoning livestock, burned. Accused of attending a gathering with the devil, burned. Accused by a neighbor, burned. Accused by a child, burned. The memorial does not explain. It does not interpret. It does not tell you how to feel. It simply presents the names and the facts and asks you to stand there in the cold and read them. All 91. The second structure is smaller. It was designed by Louise Bourgeois, the French-American artist who spent her career creating work about trauma, memory, and the body. She was 98 years old when she designed this piece. She died before the memorial was completed. What she left behind is a small, square building with mirrored walls. Inside, there is a single metal chair. Surrounding the chair, built into the floor in a perfect circle, are flames. Eternal flames fed by gas lines, burning constantly, day and night, summer and winter, in a room where every surface reflects. If you sit in the chair, you are surrounded by fire. The flames reflect in the mirrors, multiplying infinitely. Hundreds of flames. Thousands. An endless repetition of fire consuming the space around you, above you, beneath you. You are inside the fire. You are the one burning, the possessed and the beloved. Bourgeois never explained the title fully, but the meaning is clear enough. The people who were burned were all three. Damned by the court. Possessed, supposedly, by the devil. Beloved, presumably by someone, before the fear came. The chair is not comfortable. It is cold metal, in a room that is somehow both hot from the flames and freezing from the Arctic air that seeps through the walls. Sitting in it feels wrong. Sitting in it feels like participating in something you should not be participating in. That is the point. The memorial is not designed to make you feel good. It is not designed to offer closure or catharsis, or a sense that justice has been served 400 years too late. It is designed to make you feel the cold and the fire, and the 91 individual lives that were taken one by one in a place where everyone knew everyone, and no one stopped it. When the memorial was unveiled in 2011, Queen Sonja of Norway attended the ceremony. She stood in the Arctic wind and spoke about the importance of remembering, about the victims, about the injustice. Most of the people living in Vardø had no idea any of this had happened. They knew the memorial was being built. They had seen the construction. But many of them did not know why. The witch trials were not part of the town's living memory. They were not taught. They were not discussed. The memorial forced the conversation. It made the past visible. It turned 91 forgotten names into 91 lights burning in the darkness. It created a physical space where the dead could be acknowledged, where their stories could be told, where anyone who wanted to could walk down that long corridor and read what had been done. I have never been to Vardø. I have never stood inside the Zumthor corridor or sat in the bourgeois chair. But I have read descriptions from people who have, and the word that comes up again and again is silence. The memorial is quiet. The Arctic is quiet. The wind and the fabric and the small flickering lights create an atmosphere of stillness that makes you feel like you have stepped out of the world and into a place where time does not work normally. And when you walk through and read the names one after another, 91 times the same pattern, accused, tried, convicted, burned. The repetition is devastating because you understand, in a way that statistics cannot convey, that each of these was a person. Each of these had a life, a family, a daily routine, a voice that sounded a particular way. Each of these woke up one day and discovered that the community they trusted was going to kill them. And now each of them is a small light in a window in the Arctic darkness, burning because someone finally decided they deserved to be remembered. The 91 people executed in Vardø were not a monolith. They were not all the same age or the same gender or accused of the same crimes. But there are patterns, and the patterns tell you everything you need to know about what this was really about. 77 of the 91 were women. Let me say that again because the number matters. 77 women, 14 men. The men who were executed were almost all Sami. The women were both Sami and Norwegian, both indigenous and settler, both old and young. The youngest was a teenager, the oldest was in her 80s. Most were middle-aged or elderly. Women in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Women who had lived through decades of hard Arctic winters. Women who had buried children, survived hunger, outlasted storms. Women who knew things. They were fishwives. Women whose husbands went to sea and who managed everything on land while the men were gone. They handled money. They made decisions. They controlled the household economy in communities where the men were absent for weeks or months at a time. They were midwives, women who delivered babies, who knew which herbs eased pain, who understood the rhythms of pregnancy and birth in a way that was both practical and, to outsiders, slightly mysterious. They were healers, women who treated illness with plants and poultices and knowledge passed down through generations. In a place where the nearest doctor was weeks of travel away, these were the people you went to when you were sick. They were widows. Women whose husbands had died at sea or in accidents or from disease. Women who lived alone or with other women, who had no man to speak for them in court or defend them against accusation. They were Sami, women who spoke a different language, practiced different customs, followed spiritual traditions that the Norwegian Danish authorities found threatening. And they were poor. Almost without exception, the women executed were not wealthy. They were not connected to powerful families. They were not protected by social status or political influence. They were vulnerable. That is the pattern. The witch trials in Vardo did not target randomly. They targeted women who were already on the margins. Women who had power in the community but no formal authority. Women whose knowledge made them useful and also made them suspect. Because here is the thing about being a healer or a midwife or a woman who knows too much. When things go well, you are valued. When things go wrong, you are blamed. If you delivered a baby and the baby lived, you were a skilled midwife. If the baby died, you were a witch who cursed the child. If you treated a neighbor's illness and they recovered, you were a healer. If they died, you poisoned them with dark magic. If you were a widow living alone and your neighbor's fishing season was good, fine. If the fishing was bad, you had summoned storms to ruin them. The same knowledge, the same skills, the same actions could be interpreted as either blessing or curse, depending on outcomes you had no control over. And once you were accused, your entire life was reinterpreted. That argument you had with your neighbor 5 years ago? Evidence of malice. That time you muttered something under your breath when someone insulted you? A curse. The fact that you were seen walking alone at night? Proof you were meeting the devil. The fact that you owned a cat? The cat was your familiar spirit. Everything you had ever done or said or been seen doing was pulled out and examined and twisted into evidence of guilt. This is what happened to 77 women in Vardo. Not because they were witches, because they were women in a community that needed someone to blame for its suffering, and women were easier to blame than God or the weather or bad luck. The 14 men who were executed were almost all Sami. This is not a coincidence. Sami men practiced traditional shamanic rituals. They used drums in their spiritual ceremonies. They had knowledge of the natural world, of weather patterns, of animal migration, that seemed uncanny to Norwegian settlers who did not understand it. To the Danish-Norwegian authorities running Vardo, Sami spiritual practices were not just unfamiliar. They were demonic. The drums were tools of sorcery. The rituals were devil worship. The knowledge was proof of a pact with Satan. Every Sami man executed in the Finnmark witch trials was accused of practicing traditional Sami spirituality. Every single one. Their culture was the crime. Their existence was the evidence. So who were the 91? They were the people the community could afford to lose, the people no one would defend, the people whose deaths would not destabilize the existing power structure because they had no power to begin with. They were women who knew too much and men who believed the wrong things. They were useful until they were not, and then they were fuel. Vardo was not the only place in northern Norway where this happened. The entire region of Finnmark, the vast Arctic territory that stretches across Norway's northern coast, was consumed by witch trials for most of the 17th century. Between 1601 and 1692, 135 people were formally executed for witchcraft in Finnmark. 135 people in a region that, at the time, had a total population of maybe 3,000 scattered across thousands of square miles of frozen coastline. Do the math. In proportional terms, this was the most intense witch persecution in European history. Not in raw numbers. The German territories executed thousands. The Spanish Inquisition burned hundreds. The Salem trials in Massachusetts, the ones everyone knows about, killed 20. But in proportion to population, nothing comes close to Finnmark. Roughly 1 in 22 people in the region was put on trial. 1 in 22 in some communities. The ratio was even worse. In Vardø specifically, 140 people were tried and 91 were executed over the course of 70 years. In a settlement of a few hundred people, this meant that nearly every family was involved either as accuser, witness, or victim. You could not avoid it. You could not stay neutral. You were either participating in the trials, or you were at risk of becoming their next target. This was not a single outburst of panic. This was not one bad year where fear got out of control and then subsided. This was 70 years of sustained persecution. Waves of trials, each one triggered by some new disaster. A bad fishing season, a storm, a disease outbreak that the community decided must have been caused by witchcraft. The trials would flare up, consume a dozen lives, then quiet down for a few years. Then something else would go wrong, and the fear would return, and a new round of accusations would begin. Each wave followed the same pattern. Someone was accused, that person under interrogation or torture named accomplices. Those accomplices were arrested and interrogated, and they named more accomplices. The circle expanded outward until either the panic exhausted itself or someone with authority stepped in and stopped it. Most of the time, no one stepped in. The Danish-Norwegian officials running Finnmark were not horrified by the trials. They encouraged them. They believed in witchcraft as firmly as the villagers did. They saw the trials as necessary as a defense against demonic forces that were especially strong in the north. Because here is the thing you need to understand about 17th century Europe. Belief in witchcraft was not a fringe position. It was mainstream. It was orthodoxy. It was what educated, theologically trained officials believed just as firmly as uneducated villagers. The difference was that in most of Europe, by the mid-1600s, central authorities were beginning to question the trials. Skepticism was growing. Legal standards were tightening. The great continental witch hunts were winding down. But Finnmark was too remote for those changes to reach. The officials in Vardø were not getting memos from Copenhagen telling them to slow down. They were not hearing about new legal precedents or theological debates, or the growing consensus that maybe, just maybe, most of the people being executed were innocent. They were alone at the edge of the world, enforcing laws that the rest of Europe was beginning to abandon, hunting witches in a place where oversight was non-existent and skepticism was dangerous. And the trials kept going. 1621, mass trials in Vardø, multiple executions. 1625, more trials, more burnings. 1629, another wave. 1651, 1653, the largest outbreak, dozens tried, 18 burned in a single winter. 1662, 1663, the final major wave, 30 women tried, 18 executed. Then, slowly, the trials wound down. Not because people stopped believing in witchcraft, but because the legal framework changed. In 1687, Norway passed a law requiring all witchcraft death sentences to be reviewed by the central government before execution. This effectively ended the mass trials because the central government was far away, and the review process was slow, and by the time approval came back, the local panic had usually subsided. The last known execution for witchcraft in Norway took place in 1695. By then, 135 people in Finnmark were dead. Vardø had killed 91 of them. Not because Vardø was uniquely evil, not because the people there were more superstitious or more cruel than people elsewhere, but because Vardø was the most remote, the most isolated, the furthest from any authority that might have intervened. The trials in Finnmark were not an anomaly. They were what happened when the broader European witch panic reached a place with no oversight, no escape, and no one watching. They were the logical conclusion of a system that believed women could summon storms, and indigenous people were in league with the devil, and the only way to protect a Christian community was to burn the threat before it spread. 91 people in Vardø, 135 in Finnmark, thousands across Europe. All of them killed by the same fear, the same logic, the same willingness to believe that the person standing next to you was the reason your life was hard. Vardø was not unique. It was just the place where the machinery of witch hunting ran longest and burned hottest because there was no one there to shut it down. Every man executed in the Finnmark witch trials was Sami, every single one. Let me be clear about what this means. The Sami are the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia. They had lived in Finnmark for thousands of years before Norwegians, Danes, or any other Europeans arrived. They had their own language, their own culture, their own ways of understanding and interacting with the natural world. And those ways terrified the colonial authorities. Sami's spiritual practice involved drums. Large, oval drums made of reindeer hide stretched over a wooden frame, painted with symbols representing animals, spirits, the sun, the moon, the forces of nature. The drums were used in ceremonies, in healing rituals, in attempts to communicate with the spirit world and predict the weather. To the Sami, the drum was a sacred object, a tool for navigating the unseen world. To the Danish-Norwegian authorities, the drum was proof of witchcraft. The officials running Vardø came from countries where witch hunting was already well established. They brought with them an entire vocabulary of demonology, a framework for understanding and prosecuting supernatural evil, and they applied that framework to the Sami without hesitation and without mercy. Sami shamanic practice was reinterpreted as devil worship. The drum was a tool for summoning demons. The chants were spells. The rituals were pacts with Satan. The fact that Sami spiritual leaders could predict weather patterns, knowledge gained from generations of careful observation of the natural world, was taken as evidence that they could control the weather through magic. And controlling the weather, in a fishing community where storms could kill 40 men in an afternoon, was the most dangerous crime imaginable. The persecution of the Sami was not incidental to the witch trials. It was central. The trials were a weapon of colonial control, a way of suppressing indigenous culture, under the guise of protecting Christian souls. When a Sami man was accused of witchcraft, the evidence against him was his culture, his language, his spiritual practices, his refusal to fully assimilate into Norwegian, Danish Christian society. The trials criminalized being Sami, and the punishment was death. Some of the Sami men executed were described in court records as noidi, the Sami word for a spiritual leader or shaman. These were men who held respected positions within their communities, who were sought out for healing, for guidance, for their knowledge of the land and the animals, and the patterns of the seasons. To their own people, they were leaders. To the colonial authorities, they were witches. One of the earliest documented trials involved a Sami man accused of using his drum to summon winds that sank Norwegian fishing boats. The court demanded he demonstrate his power. He refused. The refusal was taken as evidence of guilt. He was executed. His drum was confiscated and destroyed. This happened again and again. Drums seized, burned, smashed. The physical objects of Sami spiritual practice systematically destroyed as evidence of witchcraft. The message was clear. Your culture is a crime. Your traditions are evil. The only way to be safe is to abandon everything that makes you who you are and become something we recognize. Assimilate or burn. Many Sami tried to assimilate. They converted to Christianity, at least outwardly. They stopped using drums in public. They hid their practices. It did not save them, because the suspicion never went away. Once you were Sami, you were always suspect. Your ancestors had practiced shamanism, so you were tainted by association. You might claim to be Christian now, but the authorities believed you were lying, that in secret you still communed with the old spirits. The witch trials gave the authorities a tool to eliminate Sami spiritual leaders and terrorize the broader Sami population into submission. And it worked. By the end of the 17th century, traditional Sami spiritual practices had been driven almost entirely underground. Drums were hidden or destroyed. Rituals were conducted in secret, if at all. The noidi were dead or silent. The cultural genocide was not complete. Sami language and traditions survived, carried forward by people who refused to let them die. But the witch trials inflicted damage that took centuries to recover from. The trials were not just about punishing individuals. They were about erasing a culture. This dimension of the Finnmark witch trials has been almost invisible in the historical record until very recently. For centuries, the trials were told, when they were told at all, as a story about superstitious villagers and unfortunate women. The Sami victims were footnotes. The colonial dimension was ignored. The fact that every executed man was indigenous, and that the trials systematically targeted Sami spiritual practices, was not considered central to the story. It has taken decades of work by Sami historians and activists to force this truth into the open, to make people understand that the Finnmark witch trials were not just a gender issue, they were a racial issue. They were not just about fear of women's power. They were about the deliberate destruction of an indigenous culture by a colonial state that saw that culture as an existential threat. When the Stilneset Memorial was built in 2011, there was debate about how to represent this. Should the Sami victims be marked separately? In the end, all 91 names are presented the same way. Same format, same plaques, same small lights in the corridor. But the Sami community in Norway has made sure that their dead are not forgotten. That the men who were killed for practicing their culture are remembered not as witches, but as victims of a colonial project that tried to erase them. 14 men, all Sami, all executed for being who they were. Her name was Siri Pedersdatter, and she was the first woman formally tried and executed in Vardø's 70-year campaign of terror. The woman whose trial set the template for everything that came after. The year was 1621, 4 years after the Christmas Eve storm that killed 40 men and shattered the community. 4 years of grief, 4 years of fear, 4 years of asking why. And finally, someone had an answer. Siri. She was accused of causing the storm, of summoning it through witchcraft, of deliberately murdering 40 men, neighbors, friends, possibly relatives, through dark magic because she had made a pact with the devil. We do not know much about who Siri was before the accusation. The court records do not tell us her age, her occupation, whether she had children, whether she was married or widowed. We know her name and her father's name, Peder, which is how she is identified. Siri, daughter of Peder. We know she lived in or near Vardø, and we know that someone accused her. The records do not say who made the first accusation. They rarely do. But someone pointed at Siri Pedersdatter and said, "She did it. She called down the storm. She killed our men." Once the accusation was made, the machinery started. Siri was arrested and brought before the court at Vardøhus fortress. The men who judged her were not from Vardø. They were foreign officials, Danes and Germans and Scotsmen appointed by the Danish-Norwegian crown to maintain order in this distant territory. They believed in witchcraft. They had grown up in countries where witch trials were common, where theological texts described in elaborate detail how witches operated, what powers they had, how to identify them, how to extract confessions. They knew what they were looking for, and they found it. The charges against Siri were specific. She had caused the Christmas Eve storm. She had killed livestock through magic, cows that stopped giving milk, sheep that died mysteriously. She had consorted with demons. She had attended gatherings on Domen, the mountain, where witches met to worship Satan. How do you defend yourself against charges like this? What evidence do you present to prove you did not summon a storm 4 years ago? What witnesses do you call to testify that you have never met the devil? There is no defense. The accusation is the conviction. Siri denied the charges at first. The records are clear on this. She told the court she was innocent. She had done nothing. She knew nothing about witchcraft or demons or storms. The court did not believe her. They had methods for extracting the truth. We do not know exactly what was done to Siri during her interrogation. The records do not describe the specific tortures in detail, but we know the methods that were common in witch trials across Europe and in Finnmark specifically. Sleep deprivation, keeping the accused awake for days until exhaustion broke their resistance. The water test, throwing the accused into the freezing Arctic Sea to see if they floated. Thumbscrews, strappado, the rack, pain applied systematically until the person being tortured said whatever their torturers wanted to hear. And what the court wanted to hear was a confession. Siri confessed. She admitted to causing the storm. She admitted to killing livestock. She admitted to attending gatherings with the devil on Damen Mountain, where she and other witches danced and drank and swore allegiance to Satan. She gave them details. The kind of details that appear in every forced confession, across every witch trial in every country where this happened. The devil appeared as a black dog. He played music. The witches flew through the air. They transformed into animals. They poisoned their neighbors. They cursed the fish and the boats and the children. These were not Ciri's memories. These were the stories the interrogators wanted to hear, the narrative framework they had brought with them from Europe, the script they expected witches to follow. And Ciri, broken by torture or fear or the sheer impossibility of proving her innocence, gave them what they wanted. She confessed. And once she confessed, she was doomed. The sentence was death by burning. In the spring of 1621, Ciri Pedersdatter was taken from the fortress to the execution ground. She was tied to a stake. Wood was piled around her. The fire was lit. She burned alive. The records do not tell us if she screamed. They do not tell us how long it took. They do not tell us if anyone in the crowd felt doubt or pity or horror. They tell us only that the sentence was carried out. Ciri Pedersdatter, convicted of witchcraft, executed by burning. And then the records move on. Because Ciri was not the end. She was the beginning. Her trial established the pattern. Her confession provided the template. Her execution proved that the system worked, that witches could be identified and punished, that the community could fight back against the supernatural forces that were destroying it. Other women were accused that same year. Other confessions were extracted. Other fires were lit. By the end of 1621, multiple women had been burned in Vardo. Ciri was the first. She was the woman who died so that the machinery of persecution could start running. And once it started, it did not stop for 70 years. I think about Ciri often, not because her story is unique. It is not. It is tragically common. But because she was first. Because she was the woman the community chose to blame for its suffering before the pattern had been established, before the confessions had been standardized, before anyone knew how far this would go. She was the test case, and when the test worked, when her confession was extracted and her execution completed, and the community felt some small measure of relief or control or justice, the door was opened. 91 people would follow her through it. But Ciri went first. She burned alone, the first victim of a terror that would consume her village for the next 7 decades. Her name is on a plaque now, in a corridor in the Arctic, beneath a small light that burns in her memory. Ciri Pedersdatter, the first. The way a person became a witch in Vardo was simple. Someone said you were. That is it. That is the entire mechanism. No evidence required. No proof. No objective standard of guilt. Someone you knew, someone you had lived alongside for years, someone you had helped or fought with or ignored, stood up and said your name. And from that moment, you were a witch. The accusation process followed a pattern, and the pattern fed on itself like a machine that generated its own fuel. It started with a misfortune. A fishing boat came back empty. A cow died, a child fell sick. A storm hit at the wrong time. Anything that disrupted the fragile equilibrium of life in the Arctic. Anything that caused loss, or fear, or grief. The community needed an explanation. And the explanation they had been taught, the explanation that had been reinforced by decades of sermons and court proceedings and public executions, was witchcraft. Someone caused this. So the question became, who? Sometimes the accusation came from a person who had a specific grievance, an old argument, a property dispute, a long-standing resentment that had festered in the close quarters of a village where privacy was impossible. The witch trial became a weapon. You could get rid of the woman who had insulted you by accusing her of cursing your livestock. You could eliminate a rival by testifying that you had seen her talking to the devil. You could settle a score that had nothing to do with witchcraft by using the one mechanism the community had for removing inconvenient people. Sometimes the accusation was more random. Someone was simply unlucky enough to be standing too close when the fear needed a target. You were a widow living alone? Suspicious. You were a healer whose remedies sometimes failed. Obviously dangerous. You were a Sami practicing traditional customs. Clearly demonic, you muttered something under your breath when someone insulted you. That was a curse. You owned a cat? The cat was your familiar spirit. You were seen walking alone at night. meeting the devil. Everything you did could be reinterpreted as evidence once the accusation was made. And once one person accused you, others followed. Because here is the terrible logic of the witch trial. If you defended an accused witch, you became suspect yourself. If you spoke up for your neighbor, if you said she was a good person who had never done anything wrong, you were either dangerously naive or you were protecting her because you were a witch too. Defending the accused was evidence of complicity. Silence was safer. So when someone was accused, most people stayed quiet. They watched. They waited to see what would happen. And the person accused was dragged to the fortress. The interrogation began with questions. Did you cause the storm? Did you kill the livestock? Did you attend the gathering on Daman? Did you meet the devil? Most people denied the accusations at first. This did not matter. Denial was expected. The court knew that witches lied. Denial was just more evidence that you were a witch, because only a witch would refuse to confess. If you continued to deny, the court had methods to change your mind. The water test was common. You were bound and thrown into the Arctic Sea. If you floated, you were a witch-proof, that the water rejected you because you had renounced your baptism. If you sank, you were innocent. Think about what this means in practice. You are thrown into water so cold that a human being will die of hypothermia within an hour. Your body, which floats naturally in salt water, keeps you on the surface. You are dragged out, freezing, your body shutting down from the cold. And the court says, you floated. You are guilty. The fact that human bodies float in salt water, that this is basic physics and has nothing to do with guilt or innocence, was apparently irrelevant. If the water test did not break you, there was torture. We do not have detailed descriptions of every torture method used in Vardo, but we have enough. Sleep deprivation, keeping you awake for days until your mind started to fracture. Thumb screws, crushing your fingers until the pain was unbearable. Strappado, hanging you by your arms tied behind your back until your shoulders dislocated. Pain applied systematically, professionally, until you confessed. And here is the thing about torture. It works. Not because it extracts the truth. It does not. But it extracts confession. Always. Given enough time and enough pain, a human being will say whatever they think will make the pain stop. You will confess to causing storms you did not cause. You will confess to attending gatherings that never happened. You will confess to meeting a devil you do not believe in. And you will name accomplices. This is the part that made the witch trials unstoppable. Because once you confessed, the court asked, who else was there? Who else danced with the devil? Who else helped you summon the storm? And you, exhausted or broken or terrified, or in so much pain that you would say anything to make it stop, gave them names. Maybe you named people you did not like, people who had wronged you, people you wanted to punish, people whose names came to mind in the moment. Maybe you named people because the interrogators suggested them, because they asked, was she there? And you said yes, because saying yes made them stop asking. Every confession generated new accusations. Every accused person, once broken, named more people. The circle expanded outward like a crack spreading through ice. One woman confessed and named 5 others. Those 5 were arrested and interrogated, and 3 of them confessed and named 7 more. Those 7 named 12. The process fed on itself. It was self-sustaining. It created its own momentum. And in a community this small where everyone knew everyone, the accusations were devastating. You did not accuse strangers. You accused your neighbor, your sister-in-law, the woman who had delivered your children, the widow down the road who had brought you soup when you were sick. These were intimate accusations born of intimate knowledge. The woman accusing you knew your daily habits, your private quarrels, your secret fears. She knew what you said when you were angry, where you went when you wanted to be alone, what you muttered under your breath. And all of that knowledge could be weaponized. That time you cursed when you spilled milk, you were casting a spell. That time you argued with a neighbor and their cow died a week later, you killed it with magic. That time you were seen walking toward Daman, you were going to meet the devil. There was no way to defend yourself because the evidence was your life. Everything you had ever done was pulled out and examined and twisted until it looked like guilt. And once the accusation was made, once the interrogation began, Once the torture started, confession was inevitable. Not always. Some people held out. Some people denied the charges even under torture. Some people went to their deaths insisting they were innocent. But most confessed, because the alternative was dying slowly from pain and cold and exhaustion, without ever making it stop. At least, confession offered an end. The accusation process was not designed to find guilty people. It was designed to confirm what the community already believed, that witches existed, that they were responsible for suffering, that they needed to be destroyed. And it worked. For 70 years it worked. One accusation leading to another, one confession generating more names, one fire lighting the next. Until 91 people were dead. There is another layer to this story, and it is the layer that makes everything make sense. The Little Ice Age. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. This is a documented period of global climate cooling that lasted roughly from 1300 to 1850, with the coldest decades occurring in the 1600s and 1700s. The exact decades when the Vardo witch trials were happening. The Little Ice Age changed everything. Temperatures dropped across Europe, but the effects were most severe in the far north. Glaciers advanced, sea ice expanded, growing seasons shortened, winters became longer and more brutal. In Finnmark, where life was already marginal, where survival depended on the fish and the brief summer growing season, and the ability to store enough food to last through the dark months, the climate shift was catastrophic. The cod, which had migrated through the Barents Sea in predictable patterns for generations, started arriving later, or not at all. The fish that did come were smaller, fewer, harder to catch. Fishing boats went out and came back empty. Families that had relied on the cod harvest for income, for food, for trade, suddenly found themselves with nothing. Starvation became common, not the slow, chronic hunger that people in Vardo were used to, but acute, desperate starvation. Winters where food ran out and people died. The cold got worse. Temperatures that had been brutal became unbearable. The sea froze in ways it had not frozen before, blocking harbors, trapping boats, making fishing impossible for months at a time. Livestock died. Cows and sheep that might have survived a normal winter froze or starved because there was not enough fodder. Children died. The old died. And the survivors looked around at the catastrophe unfolding and asked the only question that mattered. Why? Why is this happening? Why now? What did we do to deserve this? The correct answer, the answer that modern science gives us, is that the climate was changing due to factors far beyond anyone's control. Volcanic eruptions, solar activity, ocean current shifts, forces operating on a global scale that no individual or community could influence. But the people of Vardo did not have modern science. They had theology, and theology told them that God controlled the weather, that natural disasters were expressions of divine will, that suffering was punishment for sin. If the fishing was failing and the cold was getting worse and people were starving, it meant God was angry, or it meant something else. It meant someone was interfering with God's creation. Someone was using dark power to disrupt the natural order. Someone was causing the climate disaster through witchcraft. This is not a theory. This is documented in the trial records. Women were explicitly accused of summoning storms, of driving fish away from the coast, of causing unseasonable cold, of making the winter last longer than it should. The accusations track with the climate, the worst years for witch trials. 1621, 1651, 1653, 1662, 1663 correspond with documented periods of extreme cold and fishing failure. When the cod did not come, the trials intensified. When the winters were especially brutal, more women burned. The witch trials were the community's response to a climate crisis they did not understand and could not control. They needed someone to blame. They needed to believe that the disaster was not random, not meaningless, not simply the result of a planet growing colder for reasons that had nothing to do with them. They needed to believe that if they could identify the person causing the suffering and punish that person, the suffering would stop. It did not stop. The climate kept getting worse. The fishing kept failing. The cold kept coming. But the community kept burning witches because the alternative, accepting that they were helpless, that no amount of punishment or prayer or sacrifice would change what was happening, was too terrifying to face. This is the mechanism. Climate disaster creates resource scarcity. Resource scarcity creates competition. Conflict creates the need for scapegoats. And the scapegoats, almost always, are the people with the least power to defend themselves. The widows, the healers, the old women, the indigenous people who practice unfamiliar customs. The witches. This pattern is not unique to Vardo. It is not unique to the 17th century. It happens whenever communities are under extreme environmental stress and do not have the tools to understand what is happening to them. It is happening now. Climate change is creating new disasters, new migrations, new resource conflicts. And in places where those disasters hit hardest, you see the same pattern. Communities looking for someone to blame, identifying vulnerable populations, turning fear into violence. The mechanisms are the same. The targets are the same. The witch trials in Vardu were not an aberration. They were not the product of medieval superstition in an unenlightened age. They were a predictable response to environmental catastrophe in a community that lacked the scientific understanding to explain what was happening and lacked the political and economic structures to respond effectively. They were what happens when people are scared and suffering and desperate for control. The Little Ice Age killed millions of people across Europe through famine and disease and cold, and it killed 91 people in Vardo through fire. Different mechanisms, same root cause. The climate changed. The community could not adapt, and someone had to pay. There is always a man in every witch hunt, in every persecution, in every campaign of terror that consumes a community. There is always someone who could have stopped it and chose not to. Someone who could have said, "Wait, are we sure about this?" Someone who could have demanded evidence, questioned confessions, pointed out the madness. Someone with enough authority that their voice might have mattered. In Vardo, that man was Pastor Jacobus Schelderup, and not only did he not stop it, he made it worse. Schelderup arrived in Vardo in 1621, the same year Siri Pedersdatter burned. He was not from Vardo, he was not from Finnmark. He was not even from Norway, he was Danish, educated at the University of Copenhagen, trained in Lutheran theology, sent north by the church to minister to the scattered communities of the Arctic coast. He was young, he was zealous, and he believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had been taught by experts, that the devil was real and witches were everywhere, and the greatest service a Christian minister could perform was to root them out. Schelderup had been educated in demonology. He had read the texts, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Daemonology, the continental witch-hunting manuals that described in elaborate detail how witches operated, what signs to look for, how to extract confessions. He knew the theory, and when he arrived in Vardo and discovered that the community was already in the grip of witch trial fever, he did not counsel restraint. He encouraged it. From the pulpit, Schelderup preached about the reality of witchcraft. He told his congregation that Satan was active in their community, that demons walked among them, that the disasters they were experiencing, the failed fishing, the brutal winters, the deaths were not natural but supernatural. He told them that witches were responsible, and he told them that identifying and punishing those witches was a holy duty. This was not an abstract theological position. This was a direct call to action. Schelderup's sermons created the ideological framework that justified the trials. He gave the community permission. No, he gave them a mandate to accuse, to interrogate, to execute. He made witch hunting a moral imperative, and he participated directly. Schelderup was present at trials. He questioned the accused. He reviewed confessions. He confirmed sentences. When women stood before the court and denied the charges, Schelderup was one of the voices insisting they were lying. When confessions were extracted through torture, Schelderup accepted them as truth. When women were sentenced to burn, Schelderup blessed the proceedings. He was not a passive observer. He was an active architect of the terror, and he stayed in Vardo for years, presiding over trial after trial, execution after execution, never once expressing doubt, never once questioning whether what was happening was just. This is the role of the religious authority in a witch hunt, not to torture directly, That was the job of the court. But to provide the moral justification, to tell the community that what they were doing was right, that God approved, that burning their neighbors was an act of righteousness. He made the fires holy. I want to be very careful here because I am not arguing that Shelderoop created the witch trials in Vardo. The trials started before he arrived. The fear was already present. The community was already looking for witches. But Shelderoop amplified everything. His authority as a minister, his education, his certainty, all of it reinforced the belief that witchcraft was real, and witches needed to die. Without Shelderoop, the trials might have burned out faster. They might have faced more skepticism. They might have been questioned by someone the community trusted. With Shelderoop, there was no room for doubt. He was the voice of God telling them they were right. Shelderoop eventually left Vardo. I do not know when or why. The records do not say. But the trials continued long after he was gone, because he had helped build a machine that no longer needed him to run. He was not the only pastor involved. Other ministers came after him. Some were zealous, some were indifferent. Some may have had private doubts but kept them private. None of them stopped it. This is what haunts me about the Vardo witch trials. Not just the women who burned, not just the 91 names on the memorial, but the people who could have intervened and did not. The officials who signed the warrants, the soldiers who dragged women from their homes, the neighbors who testified, the pastors who blessed the fires. All of them participated. All of them made choices. And almost none of them chose to say, enough. Shelderoop was just one man. But he was one man in a position of authority, in a role that carried moral weight, at a moment when his voice could have made a difference. And he used that voice to say, burn them. 91 people died in Vardo. Shelderoop did not light the fires, but he told the community that the fires were necessary, and that made him responsible. The fortress still stands. Varduhu's fortress, built in the 1730s to replace earlier fortifications, sits on the waterfront like a stone star pressed into the Arctic landscape. The current structure is newer than most of the witch trials, but it occupies the same ground, serves the same function, holds the same position of power over the town, and beneath it, in the earlier fortress that stood on this site during the trials, there was a room. The records call it the Witch's Hole, a cell carved into the foundation, small and dark and cold even by the standards of an Arctic winter. This is where accused women were held while they waited for trial, while they were interrogated, while the court decided whether they would live or burn. The dimensions are not recorded. The exact location within the old fortress structure is unclear, but we know it existed because the trial documents reference it again and again. Held in the Witch's Hole, interrogated in the Witch's Hole before sentence could be carried out. Imagine being locked in that space. Stone walls, no windows, no light except what filtered down from above or what the guards brought with them when they came to question you. The temperature inside a stone cell in winter in the Arctic. Cold that seeps into your bones, that makes your fingers go numb, that turns your breath to visible clouds in the darkness. And the isolation, not for hours or days, for weeks, sometimes months, waiting to be called, waiting to be questioned, waiting to find out if you would be released or if you would be dragged to the execution ground and tied to a stake. The isolation was part of the interrogation. Sleep deprivation was another part. The technique is simple, and it is devastating. You prevent the accused from sleeping. You keep them awake through noise, through questions asked at irregular intervals, through physical discomfort, through the simple expedient of not allowing them to lie down or close their eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. After 24 hours without sleep, cognitive function begins to deteriorate. Memory becomes unreliable. Concentration fails. After 48 hours, hallucinations begin. The mind starts to break. After 72 hours, most people will say anything to be allowed to rest. The interrogators knew this. Sleep deprivation was a standard technique in European witch trials, described in the manuals recommended by experts, legally sanctioned by courts that understood its effectiveness. It leaves no marks. It causes no permanent physical damage. It simply destroys the accused person's ability to resist. And when sleep deprivation was not enough, there was pain. Thumb screws, small metal devices that fit over the fingers and tighten with a screw mechanism. Simple, portable, effective. You place the accused person's thumb or finger between the two bars of the screw. You turn the handle. The bars close together, slowly, applying increasing pressure to the bone and nail. The pain is immediate, and it escalates rapidly, crushing pain that makes it impossible to think about anything except making it stop. And it stops when you confess. When you say, "Yes, I am a witch. Yes, I caused the storm. Yes, I attended the gathering. Yes, I will tell you everything you want to hear." Then the screw is loosened and the pain recedes, and you are left with crushed fingers and the knowledge that you have just condemned yourself. Strappado was worse. This is a torture method that has been used for centuries across multiple continents. It is effective. It is agonizing. And it was used in Vardo. The technique, your hands are tied behind your back. A rope is attached to your wrists. You are hoisted into the air by that rope, so that your full body weight hangs from your arms twisted behind you. Your shoulders dislocate almost immediately. The pain is beyond description. Your own body weight becomes the instrument of torture. Gravity pulls you down. The rope holds you up. Your shoulder joints separate. And you hang there, screaming, until you confess or until the interrogators decide to lower you. Sometimes weights were added to the feet to increase the strain. Sometimes the accused was dropped suddenly and then jerked to a stop, multiplying the damage to the shoulders and back. This was not done in secret. This was not some aberration carried out by rogue officials. This was legal procedure sanctioned by the court, justified by the belief that extracting the truth from a witch required extraordinary measures. The records are clear about this. Torture was used. Confessions were extracted through pain and exhaustion and fear. And once a woman confessed, once she said the words the court wanted to hear, her confession was written down and presented as evidence. The fact that the confession had been obtained through torture was not considered grounds to doubt its validity. The logic was circular and airtight. Witches lie, so denial proves nothing. Pain forces witches to tell the truth, so confessions obtained through torture are reliable. There was no way out. If you denied the charges, you were tortured until you confessed. If you confessed immediately, you were sentenced to death. The outcome was predetermined. The interrogation was simply the process of moving you from accusation to execution. Some women held out. Some women endured the torture and continued to deny the charges even when their bodies were breaking. These women were often sentenced to death anyway, convicted on the testimony of other accused women who had named them under interrogation. Or they were subjected to the water test, thrown into the Arctic Sea, and when they floated, because human bodies float in salt water, their survival was taken as proof of guilt. Some women died during interrogation, died from the cold, from exhaustion, from injuries sustained during torture, from simply giving up. Their bodies were burned anyway. Death was not enough. The corpse of a convicted witch still needed to be destroyed by fire. I want you to think about what it was like to be a woman in Vardu during the trials, to know that these rooms existed, to know that women you knew had been dragged into that fortress and had not come out, to know that if someone accused you, you would be next, to know that the interrogation was waiting. The cold cell, the sleepless nights, the thumb screws, the rope, to know that your body would be broken until you said what they wanted you to say, and then you would burn. This knowledge was in the air. It was in every conversation, every glance, every interaction between neighbors. The fortress was visible from anywhere in town. You could see it from your house. You could see it when you walked to the harbor. You could see it when you hung fish on the drying racks. And you knew what happened inside. The interrogation chambers were not just physical spaces. They were threats. They were the mechanism by which the trials sustained themselves. They were the reason women confessed. They were the reason accused women named accomplices. They were the reason the circle of accusation kept expanding. Because when you are hanging from a rope by your dislocated shoulders in a freezing stone cell in the Arctic, when the pain is so intense that you cannot think, cannot breathe, cannot do anything except scream, you will say names. You will say any name to make it stop, and then those names become the next victims. The fortress is still there. You can visit it. You can walk through the same gates where accused women were dragged in chains. The witch's hole is gone, filled in, or built over during later renovations. But the space it occupied is still there, somewhere beneath the current structure, a void in the stone that once held women waiting to die. 91 women passed through that space, some for weeks, some for months. All of them cold, all of them afraid, all of them knowing what was coming. The interrogation chambers were where the witch trials became real, where accusation turned into confession, where human beings were systematically broken until they said what the system needed them to say. And then they were taken outside and burned. The charges against the women of Vardu sound like fever dreams, flying through the air in the shape of animals, having sexual intercourse with demons, transforming into seals to sink ships, spoiling butter by looking at it, making men impotent through curses, attending midnight gatherings on mountain peaks where the devil played violin. These are the actual accusations from the court records, not exaggerations, not later embellishments. The precise charges that women were tried for, convicted of, and executed for. Let me tell you what they were actually accused of doing: causing shipwrecks. This was the most common accusation and the most dangerous. In a fishing community where men went to sea in small boats and storms could kill dozens at once, the ability to summon wind or raise waves was the ultimate crime. Women were accused of tying knots in rope to trap wind inside. When they untied the knot, the wind was released and a storm would strike. Women were accused of throwing objects into the sea, stones, sticks, pieces of cloth, that would transform into waves and swallow boats. Women were accused of simply willing ships to sink, of speaking curses that summoned tempests, of making pacts with sea demons who would drag sailors to the bottom. The specificity is what makes it devastating. A woman would be accused of causing a specific storm on a specific date that sank a specific boat and killed specific men. The court would ask, "Where were you on the afternoon of March 12th when the fishing fleet was lost?" And the woman would say, "I was home. I was cooking. I was mending nets." And the court would say, "Multiple witnesses saw you walking toward the shore that morning. They saw you throw something into the water. 3 hours later, the storm hit. What did you throw? What spell did you cast? Which demon did you summon? How do you defend yourself against that? How do you prove you did not cause a storm?" Spoiling butter. This accusation appears in multiple trials, and it reveals the everyday paranoia that sustained the witch hunts. Butter making was women's work. You took cream, churned it, and if you did everything right, you got butter. If something went wrong, if the temperature was off, if the cream was old, if you churned too fast or too slow, the butter would not set properly. It would stay liquid or turn rancid. This was chemistry. This was the result of natural processes that people did not fully understand but had learned to manage through experience. Or it was witchcraft. Women were accused of cursing their neighbor's butter, of speaking spells that prevented cream from churning, of sending their spirit in the form of a cat to spoil dairy products through proximity. The trial records describe women confessing under torture that they had ruined butter by looking at it with malicious intent, by muttering under their breath while a neighbor was churning, by casting the evil eye. One woman was accused of causing all the butter in Vardo to spoil simultaneously, a feat that would have required either extraordinary supernatural power or, more likely, a batch of cream that had gone bad before it was distributed. She burned for it, making men impotent. This accusation has a sexual dimension that the others lack, and it reveals the deep anxiety about women's power over male bodies. Women were accused of casting spells that made men unable to perform sexually, unable to father children, unable to maintain erections. The methods varied. Some women were accused of tying knots in rope while speaking a man's name, which would magically bind his sexual function. Some were accused of mixing potions. Some were accused of simply wishing impotence upon a man who had angered them. The court records describe men testifying that they had been healthy and virile until they offended a particular woman, after which they became impotent. The cause and effect was clear to them. The woman had cursed them. The fact that impotence has many natural causes, age, stress, illness, psychological factors, was not considered. The fact that men might lie about impotence, or exaggerate it to harm a woman they disliked was not considered. If a man said a woman had cursed his genitals, the court believed him. Shape-shifting into seals. This accusation appears specifically in coastal communities, and it draws on traditional beliefs about selkies, seal people from northern European folklore who could shed their skin and take human form. Women were accused of transforming into seals to swim out to fishing boats and sink them, of using seal form to travel long distances instantly, of returning to human form afterward, with no one the wiser. How do you prove you were not a seal? How do you demonstrate that you did not transform into an animal, swim through the Arctic Ocean, and then change back? The accusation is unfalsifiable. There is no evidence that could disprove it. The very impossibility of the charge makes it impossible to defend against. Flying through the air, women confess to flying. Not metaphorically, not in dreams. They confess to actual physical flight through the Arctic sky. Some said they flew in their own bodies. Some said they transformed into birds or cats or other animals before flying. Some said the devil carried them. They described traveling from Vardo to other villages in minutes, flying to mountain peaks for gatherings, soaring over the ocean to curse fishing boats from above. These confessions were extracted through torture and coaching. The interrogators had read the continental witch-hunting manuals. They knew what witches were supposed to do, and they asked leading questions until the accused women described doing exactly those things. Did you fly to the gathering? No. More pain. Days without sleep. The thumbscrews. The rope. Did you fly to the gathering? Yes. How did you fly? The devil carried me. In what form did he appear? A black dog. And what did you do when you arrived? We danced. We drank. We swore allegiance to Satan. Every confession follows the same script, because it is a script. The interrogators wrote it, the accused women performed it, and the court treated it as factual testimony. Sexual relations with demons. This is the accusation that appears in virtually every European witch trial, and Vardo was no exception. Women confessed to having sex with the devil, with demons, with evil spirits in the form of men or animals. They described the devil's penis as cold. They described the sex as painful and joyless. They described being forced to perform acts they found degrading. These confessions are disturbing for multiple reasons. First, because they were extracted through torture from women who may have experienced actual sexual violence and were now being forced to describe that violence in supernatural terms. Second, because the interrogators were obsessed with sexual details. They asked explicit questions. They demanded descriptions into a form of psychological violation. Third, because the confessions reveal what the male interrogators believed about female sexuality, that women were prone to demonic seduction, that female sexual desire was inherently suspect, that any woman who enjoyed sex was probably trafficking with evil. The charges were not random. They followed patterns. They revealed what the community feared: storms and starvation and sexual inadequacy and the uncontrollable forces of nature. And they revealed what the community believed: that women had power over those forces, that female knowledge was dangerous, that the old woman who knew herbs, and the widow who lived alone, and the Sami woman who practiced traditional healing were all potential threats. The accusations were impossible to defend against, because they were unfalsifiable. You cannot prove you did not fly through the air. You cannot prove you did not transform into a seal. You cannot prove you did not meet the devil on a mountain. The accusation was the conviction, and the conviction was death. There is a special kind of horror in what was done to the children of Vardo, not just the children of accused women, though they suffered too, watching their mothers dragged away and burned, but the children who were used as witnesses, who were coached, coerced, or terrified into testifying against their own mothers, grandmothers, aunts, neighbors. Children as young as 7 stood in court and said, "I saw her fly through the air. I saw her at the gathering on the mountain with the devil." And the court believed them. The use of child witnesses in witch trials was not unique to Vardo. It happened across Europe. Children were considered specially vulnerable to demonic influence, but also specially able to see through witches' disguises. A child's testimony was given weight because children were thought to be innocent, uncorrupted, incapable of the kind of sophisticated lying that adults engaged in. This was, of course, nonsense. Children are capable of lying. Children are capable of being manipulated. Children are capable of saying what adults want them to say, especially when those adults have authority and the child is afraid. And the children of Vardo were terrified. The court records show children being brought in for interrogation after their mothers or other relatives had been accused. The children were questioned about what they had seen, what they knew, whether their mother had done anything suspicious. And when the children said no, nothing, I saw nothing suspicious, the interrogators pressed harder. Are you sure? Think carefully. Your mother's soul is at stake. Your own soul may be at stake if you are hiding the truth. Did you ever see your mother talking to animals? Did you ever see her walking alone at night? Did you ever hear her muttering words you did not understand? Did she ever take you somewhere strange? The questions were leading. The pressure was immense, and children, who trusted adults to tell them what was real, began to doubt their own perceptions. Maybe mother was doing something wrong. Maybe the things I saw were suspicious. Maybe I need to tell them what they want to hear so everyone will be safe. Some children were threatened directly. If you do not tell the truth, you are protecting a witch, and protecting a witch makes you guilty too. Do you want to burn with your mother? Or do you want to help us save her soul by making her confess? This is how you turn a child into a weapon. You tell them that testifying against their mother is an act of love, that it will save her. That confession will purge the evil from her soul, and maybe the court will show mercy. You tell them this, and then you extract testimony, and then you use that testimony to convict, and then you burn the mother while the child watches. Marin Olader was 12 when they used her. Her story is the one I cannot stop thinking about, the one I already told you, but it bears repeating because it is the clearest example of what was done to children in Vardo. Marin's mother burned. Then her aunt burned. Then Marin was brought to the fortress and interrogated. She was 12. She was an orphan. She had no one to protect her. And they asked her, who else was at the gathering? They asked until she answered, 5 names, 5 women. All 5 burned. Marin survived, but she had to live with what she had done. She had to live in the same village where the families of those 5 women lived. She had to see their faces. She had to know that she had sent them to the fire. She was 12. The court records from other trials show similar patterns. A child testifies that she saw her grandmother flying through the air. A boy testifies that his mother took him to a gathering on the mountain where he saw the devil. A 7-year-old girl testifies that her aunt transformed into a cat and climbed into her window at night. These testimonies are not memories. They are scripts. They are the result of adults asking questions in ways that generate the answers the adults want. Did you see Grandma do anything strange? Well, one time she was walking really fast and I couldn't keep up. Was she flying? I don't know. Think carefully. Was she flying? Maybe? Are you sure? Yes. This is how false memories are created. This is how children become convinced they have seen things they have not seen. And once the child testifies, the testimony is written down and presented as evidence, and the adult is convicted. Some children testified willingly, even enthusiastically. This is the darkest part. Some children, especially children who had been mistreated or neglected or who held grudges against their parents, saw the trials as an opportunity. They could hurt the adult who had hurt them. They could get attention from the court. They could feel powerful for the first time in their powerless lives. A child who testified against her mother became important. People listened to her. Officials asked her questions. She was at the center of something significant. And if that testimony sent her mother to the stake, well, mother had been cruel anyway. Mother had hit her. Mother had yelled. Mother deserved it. This is what the trials did to children. They turned ordinary childhood resentments into weapons of execution. They gave children the power to kill and then left them to live with what they had done. Not every child who testified understood what was happening. Younger children, 7 or 8 or 9 years old, did not grasp that their testimony would lead to execution. They did not understand that saying, "I saw Grandma talking to a black dog," meant Grandma would burn. They found out later. They found out when they were brought to watch the execution. when they saw the woman they had testified against tied to a stake and set on fire. What does that do to a child? What does it do to your understanding of truth, of trust, of your own capacity for harm, when you are 8 years old and you watch your grandmother burn because you said she talked to a dog? The children of Vardo were victims too. Not in the same way as the women who burned. The children lived, but they were used, manipulated, traumatized, and then left to carry the weight of what they had done or what had been done to them. The system that used children as witnesses was monstrous. It destroyed families. It destroyed childhoods. It destroyed the basic trust that should exist between parent and child. And it worked. Child testimony was compelling. It was believed. It sent women to the fire. The children were too young to refuse, too powerless to resist, too trusting to understand that the adults asking them questions were not trying to help them but to extract ammunition. And when the trials finally ended, when the last fire went out, the children who had testified were still there, still living in Vardo, still carrying the memories of what they had said and what had happened because they said it. I hope someone was kind to them. I hope someone told them it was not their fault. I hope, here is a question you should be asking, what happened to the property? When a woman was convicted of witchcraft and executed, her house, her land, her livestock, her possessions, everything she owned, did not simply disappear. It went somewhere, and where it went reveals a truth about the witch trials that is uglier and more mundane than supernatural panic. The trials were profitable. Not for everyone, not in a way that made anyone rich, but profitable enough to create financial incentives. Profitable enough that some accusations were motivated not by fear of witchcraft, but by greed. When a person was convicted of witchcraft, their property was forfeit to the state. In Vardo, this meant the property was divided between the Danish-Norwegian crown, the local church, and the officials who had prosecuted the case. The percentages varied depending on the specific circumstances and the local arrangements, but the pattern was consistent. Conviction meant confiscation, and if the convicted witch had accused others, if she had named accomplices during her interrogation, those people could also be prosecuted, and their property could also be seized. The witch trial became a machine that generated wealth for the authorities, not massive wealth. Most of the women executed in Vardo were not rich. They were fishwives, widows, women who owned small plots of land or a few animals or modest homes. But in a community this poor, in an environment this harsh, even small amounts of property mattered. A house, a fishing boat, a dozen sheep, a plot of land near the harbor. These were valuable assets in a place where survival was difficult and every resource counted, and they could be acquired through accusation. Let me be very clear about what I am saying. I am not arguing that every witch trial in Vardo was motivated by property seizure. I am not arguing that officials sat around calculating the value of potential victims before deciding who to accuse. But I am arguing that the financial incentive was real, and that it influenced some accusations, and that women who owned property were more likely to be targeted than women who owned nothing. The clearest example of this pattern is in the trials of widows. Widows were disproportionately represented among the accused. This is true across European witch trials generally, and it is especially true in Vardo. Why widows? Because widows owned property. When a man died, his property passed to his widow unless there were adult sons to claim it. A widow with no sons became the owner of her late husband's house, land, boat, everything. She controlled assets that, in a normal succession, would have passed to male heirs, and she was vulnerable. She had no husband to defend her. She had no male authority figure to speak for her in court or to protect her from accusation. She was alone. If a widow was accused, convicted, and executed, her property was forfeit. It reverted to the crown, which could then distribute it or sell it or grant it to someone else. And if that widow had been a thorn in someone's side, if she had refused to sell land, if she had disputed a boundary, if she had been difficult, or demanding, or simply inconvenient, the witch trial provided a solution. Accuse her, convict her, execute her, take her land. This is not speculation. The trial records show cases where property disputes preceded accusations, where neighbors who had been fighting over land or fishing rights suddenly became accusers and witnesses in witchcraft trials. The records show widows being accused shortly after inheriting valuable property from their late husbands. The records show that after execution, the convicted woman's land was often granted to people who had been involved in the trial, witnesses, accusers, or officials. The pattern is clear enough that historians studying the Finnmark trials have concluded that economic motivation was a significant factor in at least some of the prosecutions, not the only factor. Not even the primary factor in most cases, but present, real, influential. There is also the question of who paid for the trials. Which trials were expensive? You had to pay for the accused to be held in prison. You had to pay guards. You had to pay the interrogators. You had to pay for the execution, the wood for the fire, the labor of building the stake, the officials who supervised. In some European jurisdictions, these costs were paid by the accused witch's family, or, if the family could not pay, by the confiscated property. This created a perverse incentive. The more witches you convicted, the more property you confiscated. The more money was available to fund more trials. The system fed itself. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to reduce the witch trials to simple greed, to argue that this was all about money and property and that the beliefs were just a cover. That is too simple. The people of Vardo genuinely believed in witchcraft. The fear was real. The grief after the Christmas Eve storm was real. But genuine belief and economic incentive are not mutually exclusive. You can truly believe that your neighbor is a witch, and also be aware that if she is convicted, you might acquire her land. You can truly fear supernatural evil, and also notice that the women being accused tend to be the ones who own valuable property. You can truly want to protect your community from demonic forces, and also benefit financially when those demonic forces are conveniently identified as people whose assets you covet. The intersection of belief and greed is where the witch trials became sustainable. If it had been only belief, the trials might have burned out faster. Once a few women were executed and the fishing still failed and the winters were still brutal, people might have realized that burning witches was not solving the problem. But if belief is reinforced by profit, if conviction brings not just spiritual satisfaction, but material gain, the trials continue. Because now there are two reasons to accuse. You believe the person is a witch, and you want their land. And those two reasons reinforce each other. 91 people were executed. 91 sets of property were confiscated. 91 houses, plots of land, boats, animals, tools, belongings, divided between the crown, the church, and the local authorities. Not enough to make anyone rich, not enough to transform Vardo's economy, but enough to matter, enough to create incentives, enough to turn accusation into a tool not just of spiritual warfare, but of economic competition. The trials destroyed lives, but they also redistributed wealth. And that is a truth worth remembering, because it means that some of the people who sent women to the fire did so not just because they were afraid of the devil, but because they wanted a house. I need to tell you how they died. Not because the details are pleasant, they are not, but because the method matters, the procedure matters. The fact that this was organized, systematic, legally sanctioned execution matters. This was not a mob. This was not a riot. This was not a spontaneous outburst of violence. This was the state killing people according to a formal process. The execution method for convicted witches in Vardo was burning at the stake. But there was variation in how this was carried out, and that variation determined whether death came quickly or slowly. In many parts of continental Europe, convicted witches were shown a specific mercy. They were strangled before being burned. The executioner would garrote the condemned person while they were tied to the stake, cutting off their air, causing death by asphyxiation in a matter of minutes. Then the fire would be lit and the body would burn, but the person was already dead. The fire was for destroying the corpse, not for killing. This was considered humane by the standards of the time. In Vardo, some women were granted this mercy. The court records specify strangled, then burned for certain executions, but others were not. Other records simply say burned, not strangled first, not granted the mercy of a quick death, just burned. Burned alive. I am not going to describe in clinical detail what happens to a human body when it is burned alive. You know what fire does. You know what pain is. What I want you to think about instead is the time. How long it took. A person tied to a stake surrounded by burning wood does not die instantly. Fire takes time to kill. The smoke can cause unconsciousness if you are lucky, if the wind is right, if you inhale enough of it before the flames reach you. But if the wind is wrong, if the fire burns unevenly, if the wood is damp or poorly stacked, you can remain conscious for minutes, long minutes, minutes during which you are burning. This is what some of the women of Vardo experienced. The execution ground was near the fortress, on a patch of open land visible from the town. Executions were public events. The community was expected to attend, required to attend in many cases, because witnessing the punishment of evil was considered both a deterrent and a spiritual duty. The condemned woman was brought from the fortress to the stake. Sometimes she walked, sometimes she was dragged, sometimes she was carried if she had already been broken by torture and could not move under her own power. She was tied to the wooden stake, ropes around her waist, her chest, sometimes her throat. Wood was piled around her. Logs, branches, kindling, arranged to create a fire hot enough to burn a human body to ash. If she was to be shown mercy, the executioner would strangle her now before the fire was lit. A cord around the throat, pressure applied, consciousness fading, death in minutes. Then the fire. If she was not shown mercy, the fire was lit while she was still conscious. The flames started at the base, in the kindling, spreading upward through the wood. Heat rises. Smoke rises. The woman at the stake would feel the heat before the flames reached her, would breathe in the smoke, would see the fire climbing toward her. And then it would reach her. I am going to stop here because I do not want to write torture pornography disguised as history. The point is not the specific physical details of burning. The point is that this was done deliberately, that it was done in public, that the community watched. Men, women, children stood in the Arctic cold and watched their neighbor burn. They watched the smoke. They heard the screams, if there were screams. They stood there until the fire burned down and the body was consumed and there was nothing left but ash and charred bone. And then they went home. Multiple women were sometimes burned together. The 1662, 1663 trials resulted in 18 executions in a single season. The records suggest that some of these were carried out simultaneously. Multiple stakes, multiple fires, multiple women burning at the same time. Imagine that scene. 18 fires, 18 women, 18 columns of smoke rising into the Arctic sky. The smell, the sound, the sight of it, this was not hidden, this was not done in secret. This was public execution designed to send a message. And the message was received. Everyone in Vardo knew what happened at the execution ground. Everyone knew what the fires meant. If you were accused, this was your future. The stake, the rope, the fire. And everyone watching. After the execution, the ashes were scattered or buried. Sometimes they were thrown into the sea. The idea was to prevent any relics from being preserved, to ensure that the witches' remains could not be used for magical purposes by other witches. Complete destruction, total erasure, body reduced to ash, ash dispersed, the person who had existed eliminated as thoroughly as possible. But here is what the authorities did not count on. Memory. You cannot burn memory. The people who watched those executions remembered. They passed the memories to their children, whether they meant to or not. The trauma was passed down, not as formal history, not as stories told around the fire, but as silence, as refusal to speak about it, as a community-wide decision to forget. And that forgetting lasted for 300 years until the memorial was built and the names were spoken again. 91 people burned, some strangled first, some not. All of them reduced to ash on the frozen ground outside Vardohu's fortress. The execution ground is still there. You can visit it. You can stand on the same patch of earth where the fires burned. The memorial sits there now. The corridor of lights. The burning chair, the flames in Louise Bourgeois' installation are eternal flames, fed by gas, burning continuously. They are not real executions. They are art. They are memory. But they burn in the same place where the real fires burned, and they do not go out. The winter of 1662 to 1663 was when Vardo broke completely. This was the worst outbreak, the largest wave of trials. The moment when the machinery of persecution reached its maximum speed and consumed 30 women in a single season. 18 of them burned. This was not a gradual escalation. This was sudden, explosive, a cascade of accusations that swept through the village like a contagion. What triggered it? The records do not give us a single clear cause. There was no singular disaster that preceded the trials, no storm that killed dozens of men, no plague that wiped out children. But there was accumulation. Years of bad fishing, years of brutal winters, the ongoing climate crisis of the Little Ice Age pressing down on a community that was already at the edge of survival. And there was precedent. By 1662, Vardo had been executing witches for 40 years. The pattern was established. The procedure was familiar. The community knew how witch trials worked. They knew that when things went wrong, you found a witch. You extracted a confession. You burned her. And then things were supposed to get better. Except things were not getting better. The fishing was still failing. The winters were still brutal. The suffering continued. So the logical conclusion was that there must be more witches. The trials had not gone far enough. The evil had not been fully rooted out. More women needed to burn. The first accusations in late 1662 followed the familiar pattern. A woman was accused, she was arrested, she was interrogated, she confessed, and she named accomplices. This is where it spiraled. Because the woman who confessed named not one or two accomplices, but many, she described a great gathering of witches, dozens of women meeting on Domen Mountain, dancing with the devil, swearing allegiance to Satan, plotting to destroy the village. She gave names, many names, and the court arrested all of them. Within weeks, the fortress was full of accused women. The witches' hole could not hold them all. Additional cells were used. Women were chained together, and they were interrogated, all of them, one by one. Sleep deprivation, torture, the water test, the thumbscrews, the rope. One confession led to another. Each woman who broke under interrogation named more accomplices. The circle expanded outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. 30 women were put on trial between late 1662 and early 1663. 30 women in a village of a few hundred people. Think about that proportion. Think about what it means for a community when 30 women are simultaneously imprisoned and accused of demonic conspiracy. Every family was involved. Every household had either an accused relative or a connection to the accused. No one was unaffected. The trials became the only thing the community could think about. Who would be arrested next? Who would be named? Whose confession would drag in new victims? The fear was no longer just fear of witchcraft. It was fear of accusation. Fear that your name would be spoken in the fortress. Fear that your neighbor or your friend or your own daughter would say your name under torture. 18 of the 30 were convicted and sentenced to death. The others were released, not because the court decided they were innocent, but because the evidence against them was too thin even by the degraded standards of the witch trials, or because they were children, or because someone with influence intervened. 18 women burned in the winter and spring of 1663. The executions did not all happen on the same day, but they were concentrated into a few weeks. Multiple women burned together on several occasions. Imagine the logistics. 18 stakes had to be prepared. 18 women had to be transported from the fortress to the execution ground. 18 times the community gathered to watch. The horror of repetition. The first execution is shocking. The second is traumatic. By the 5th, by the 10th, by the 15th, something in the observers breaks. You become numb to it. Or you become convinced that this is normal, that this is what justice looks like, that these women must truly be guilty, because surely we would not be doing this otherwise. The mass trial did not happen in isolation. It was enabled by people who had specific roles and who made specific choices. The interrogators who applied torture and extracted confessions, the judges who reviewed the confessions and handed down sentences, the executioner who built the stakes and lit the fires. the guards who dragged women from cells to the execution ground, the officials who recorded everything in meticulous detail, documenting each accusation, each confession, each sentence, each execution, and the community members who testified, who said, "Yes, I saw her walking toward the mountain. Yes, I heard her muttering. Yes, my cow died after she looked at it." All of these people participated. All of them had agency, and almost none of them said no. There was one exception. Judge Mandrup Peterson Schonebel began to see the madness for what it was during the 1662, 1663 trials. He had been assigned to review the cases, and when he examined the evidence, the confessions extracted through torture, the testimony from terrified children, the complete absence of anything resembling proof, he was horrified. He started pushing back, questioning sentences, refusing to confirm death penalties, sending cases back for review. He could not stop all of it. 18 women still burned, but he saved some. He intervened on behalf of children like Maren Olatter, sentencing them to workhouses instead of execution. And he began the process of dismantling the legal framework that made the trials possible. But that came later. In the winter of 1662, 1663, the fires burned. 18 women. Multiple executions. Weeks of smoke rising from the execution ground. The worst outbreak in Vardo's 70-year history of witch trials. And when it was over, when the last fire burned out and the last ashes were scattered, the community was left with what it had done. 30 women accused, 18 burned, families destroyed, trust shattered. The fishing did not improve. The winters did not get easier. The suffering did not stop, because witchcraft had never been the problem. Fear was the problem. Grief was the problem. The community's inability to accept that suffering is sometimes random and meaningless was the problem. And burning women did not solve any of it. The 1662, 1663 trials were the peak. After this, the trials began to wind down. Not immediately, not completely, but the frequency decreased. The intensity faded, partly because Schonebel and other officials began to intervene, partly because the community had exhausted itself, partly because there was a limit to how many women you could burn before you started to run out of women. But the damage was done. 18 women burned in a single season. 18 lights now glow in the memorial corridor. 18 names on plaques. 18 stories that ended in fire. The 1662 mass trial was the moment when Vardo's witch hunt reached its fullest, most destructive expression. It was the proof that the system, once started, could accelerate beyond anyone's control. It was the demonstration that fear, given the right conditions, can consume an entire community. And it was the reason that when historians study the Finnmark witch trials, they focus on Vardo. Not because Vardo was uniquely evil, but because Vardo showed what happens when all the conditions align: isolation, climate crisis, religious zealotry, economic incentive, and a community willing to turn on itself. 18 women in one winter. The fires burned for weeks, and when they finally went out, Vardo was left standing in the ashes of what it had done. Her name was Marit Olofsdatter, and she should not have been a target. She was not a marginal figure. She was not a widow living alone on the edge of town. She was not Sami. She was not poor. Marit was a wealthy Norwegian woman, the widow of a prosperous merchant, owner of substantial property in Vardo, and that is exactly why they came for her. Marit's trial in 1663 is one of the best documented cases from the Finnmark witch trials, and the documentation reveals something crucial: the intersection of misogyny, greed, and religious fervor. When all three of those forces converge on a single woman, she burns. Marit's husband had been successful. He had owned boats, property, trade goods. When he died, all of it passed to Marit. She became one of the wealthiest people in Vardo, a woman, controlling assets, making decisions, refusing to remarry and transfer her property to a new husband. This made her powerful, and power made her dangerous. The accusations against Marit followed the standard script. She was accused of practicing witchcraft, of attending gatherings on Domen Mountain, of consorting with the devil, of using magic to harm her neighbors. But the timing is revealing. Marit was accused in 1663 during the mass trial wave, after multiple other women had already been arrested and had begun naming accomplices under torture. Her name was spoken in the fortress by women who were being tortured. Did they name her because they genuinely believed she was a witch? Or did they name her because they knew she was wealthy and unpopular and a safe target? The trial records show that Marit had been involved in property disputes. She had refused to sell land to people who wanted to buy it. She had been aggressive in defending her late husband's estate against claims from his relatives. She had made enemies, and in Vardo, in 1663, having enemies was dangerous. Once Marit was accused, the process followed the familiar pattern. She was arrested and brought to the fortress. She was interrogated. She denied the charges initially. The court did not believe her denials. She was subjected to the water test. She was thrown into the Arctic Sea, bound in winter. She floated. Of course she floated. Human bodies float in salt water. But the court interpreted this as proof of guilt. After the water test, hypothermic and broken, Marit was interrogated again. The records indicate she was tortured, though the specific methods are not described in detail. She confessed, she admitted to practicing witchcraft, she admitted to attending gatherings. She admitted to making a pact with the devil. She gave them the confession they wanted, and then she named accomplices. This is where Marit's case becomes especially tragic, because the women she named under torture were also arrested, also tried, also convicted. Marit's confession, extracted through pain and cold and fear, fed the machine that had already consumed her. She was sentenced to death and burned at the stake in the spring of 1663. After her execution, her property was confiscated and divided between the crown, the church, and local officials. The land she had fought to keep, the assets she had defended, the wealth that had made her a target. All of it was taken. Who benefited? The officials who prosecuted her case. The church that received a portion of her estate. The crown, which claimed the rest. And possibly the people she had been in conflict with, the people who had wanted her land and her property, and who now saw it redistributed. Marit's trial reveals the mechanics of how a wealthy woman could be eliminated when she became inconvenient. You accuse her of witchcraft. You torture her. You take her property. The system provided a legal framework for what was essentially state-sanctioned theft. But it was not just theft. It was also misogyny. Because Marit's crime was not just being wealthy. Her crime was being a woman who controlled wealth. If she had been a man, a wealthy merchant with property and influence, she would not have been vulnerable in the same way. Men were accused of witchcraft in Vardo, but they were almost all Sami men accused of practicing traditional shamanism. Wealthy Norwegian men were not targets, but wealthy Norwegian women were, because a woman controlling property disrupted the social order. A widow who refused to remarry disrupted the patriarchal structure. A woman making decisions, defending her interests, refusing to submit to male authority, that was threatening. The witch trial gave the community a way to eliminate that threat. Marit's case also reveals the role of female testimony in sustaining the trials. Most of the women who named Marit as an accomplice were themselves accused witches being tortured in the fortress. They named her to make the pain stop, but their testimony, regardless of how it was obtained, was used to convict her. Women accusing women. Women's confessions used to destroy other women. The system turned women into weapons against each other. Marit Olafsdatter died in 1663. Her name is on a plaque in the Stilneset Memorial. The plaque summarizes her trial, her accusation, her confession, her execution. It does not mention that she was wealthy. It does not mention the property disputes. It does not mention who benefited from her death. But the silence speaks, because Marit's story is not just about one woman. It is about the pattern of how witch trials were used to eliminate women who had power, who had property, who had refused to conform to the role society expected them to play. Burn the witch, take her land, solve two problems at once. Marit Olafsdatter should not have been vulnerable. She had wealth, she had status, she had the protection that property was supposed to provide. But none of it saved her, because in Vardo in 1663, being a woman was more dangerous than being poor, and being a woman with property was most dangerous of all. The 14 men executed in the Finnmark witch trials were all Sami. All of them. This was not coincidence. This was targeted cultural genocide. The men who burned were not random victims of paranoia. They were spiritual leaders, healers, practitioners of traditional Sami shamanic religion. They were Noedi. The Noedi were the religious authorities of Sami culture. They were the people who communicated with the spirit world, who performed healing rituals, who used sacred drums to predict weather and find lost reindeer and protect the community from harm. To the Sami, the Noedi were essential. They were the connection between the human world and the spiritual forces that governed nature. To the Danish-Norwegian colonial authorities, the Noedi were witches. The persecution of the Noedi was not incidental to the witch trials. It was central. It was deliberate. It was an explicit attempt to destroy Sami spiritual practices and force assimilation into Lutheran Christianity. The drum was the symbol of everything the authorities hated. Sami drums were large, oval, made of reindeer hide stretched over a wooden frame. They were painted with symbols, animals, spirits, the sun, the moon, representations of the forces that governed the world. The Noedi used the drum in ceremonies. They would beat the drum, chant, enter a trance state, and communicate with the spirit world. They would use the drum to predict the weather, to find lost things, to heal the sick, to protect against harm. This was shamanism. This was a spiritual practice that predated Christianity in northern Scandinavia by thousands of years, and the colonial authorities wanted it destroyed. When a Noedi was accused of witchcraft, the evidence against him was his drum. The fact that he owned a drum was proof of sorcery. The fact that he used the drum in ceremonies was proof of devil worship. The fact that he could predict weather patterns, knowledge gained through generations of careful observation, was proof that he could control the weather through magic. And controlling the weather, in a fishing community, was a capital crime. The trial records describe Noedi being arrested with their drums. The drums were confiscated as evidence. They were presented in court as proof of witchcraft, and then they were destroyed, burned, smashed, systematically eliminated. This was not just about punishing individuals. This was about erasing culture. Every drum destroyed was a piece of Sami spiritual heritage lost. Every Noedi executed was a break in the transmission of traditional knowledge. The witch trials were a tool of colonization. They gave the authorities a legal framework to eliminate Sami spiritual leaders and terrorize the broader Sami population into abandoning their traditions. One of the documented cases involves a Sami man accused of using his drum to summon winds that sank Norwegian fishing boats. He was brought to court. The court demanded he demonstrate his power. "Show us," they said. "Summon a wind right now." He refused. The refusal was taken as evidence of guilt. If he truly had no power, he would have tried to demonstrate it and failed. The fact that he refused meant he was hiding his demonic abilities. He was executed. His drum was burned. Another case describes a Noedi accused of using drumming ceremonies to curse livestock and cause disease. The evidence was that he had performed a healing ritual for a sick child, and the child had died anyway. In Sami culture, the fact that the ritual was performed was evidence that the Noedi was trying to help. In the colonial legal framework, the fact that the child died was evidence that the Noedi had cursed the child. Same action, opposite interpretations. The Noedi was executed. The persecution went beyond the trials. Sami spiritual practices were criminalized across Finnmark. Drumming was banned. Joik, traditional Sami singing, was suppressed. Shamanic ceremonies were driven underground. The message was clear: abandon your culture or face prosecution. Many Sami converted to Christianity, at least outwardly. They attended Lutheran church services. They had their children baptized. They stopped using drums in public. But the suspicion never went away, because the authorities did not trust Sami conversions. They believed that Sami people were still secretly practicing shamanism, still communing with the old spirits, still loyal to the devil. Once you were Sami, you were always suspect. And the witch trials gave the authorities a tool to eliminate anyone they suspected of maintaining traditional practices. The destruction was not total. Sami culture survived. Sami language, traditions, spiritual practices continued, carried forward by people who hid them, who practiced in secret, who refused to let them die. But the damage was immense. Entire generations of no-ID were killed or silenced. Sacred drums were destroyed by the hundreds. Spiritual knowledge that had been passed down for millennia was lost when the people who carried it were executed. The Finnmark witch trials were not just about gender. They were about race. They were not just about fear of women's power. They were about colonial control over an indigenous population. They were not just about supernatural panic. They were about the deliberate suppression of a culture that the colonizers did not understand and did not want to exist. The 14 men who burned were victims of this. Their names are on plaques in the Stelneset Memorial, alongside the names of the women who died. But for a long time, their stories were invisible. The witch trials were told, when they were told at all, as a story about women. The Sami dimension was ignored or minimized. It has taken decades of work by Sami historians, activists, and scholars to force this truth into the open, to make people understand that the Finnmark witch trials were not just a gender tragedy, they were a colonial tragedy, to make people acknowledge that every man executed was indigenous, and that this was not coincidence but policy. The persecution of the no-ID was cultural genocide. It was the systematic elimination of Sami spiritual leaders and the destruction of the religious practices that held Sami culture together. And it happened under the legal cover of witch trials. 14 men, 14 no-ID, 14 drums burned, 14 lives taken, and with them, centuries of spiritual knowledge, healing practices, and cultural continuity lost. The Sami community has not forgotten. When the Stelneset Memorial was built, there were debates about how to represent the Sami victims. Should they be marked separately? Should their cultural identity be highlighted? In the end, all 91 names are presented the same way. But the Sami community has made sure their people are remembered, not as witches, not as criminals, as victims of colonialism, as casualties of a campaign to erase their culture, as people who died for refusing to abandon who they were. The no-ID persecution is the part of the Vardo witch trials that has been buried deepest. It is the truth that took longest to emerge. It is the dimension of the story that forces us to see the trials not as a relic of medieval superstition, but as a tool of colonial violence. 14 men, all Sami, all targeted for practicing their culture, all executed under the legal fiction of witchcraft. Their drums are gone, their voices are silent, but their names remain, and the truth of what was done to them is finally being told.